Some goodbyes are whispers you never forget. She looked too weak to speak, but then she did. "Run from my son," she said, and then she was gone. Just like that, no goodbye. No take care of him. Just that one sentence sharp enough to stay with me for the rest of my life. If you've ever had someone you trusted, a mother, a mentor, look you in the eye before their last breath and warn you about the person you share a bed with, then maybe you'll understand why I didn't sleep that night. Maybe you'll understand why I had to find out the truth no matter what it cost. Because once you hear something like that, you can't unhear it. You can't go back to normal. Tell me, what would you have done if you were me? Let's go back to that room. To that moment. And I'll show you what came next. The hospice room was quiet. Too quiet. The kind that makes your own breath feel loud. There was a bottle of lavender lotion half-used on the bedside tray. Margot's hand rested near it, thin-veined pale against the white sheet. I sat beside her watching the sunset spill across the Victorian wallpaper. Even now she looked dignified. There were cracks in her teacup on the windowsill. She'd always insisted on drinking her tea in that cup even here. Said it made her feel more human. That was Margot. Always composed. Even with a morphine drip in her arm and time running out. Earlier that week, she had held my hand and said, "There's still time to see things clearly." I thought she meant her vision. Her eyes had been failing. I didn't realize she was talking about me. About him. I remember the way her fingers gripped my wrist tight out of nowhere. "Run from my son," she whispered. Not a plea. Not a riddle. A warning. Then her breath caught just once. And the heart monitor let out a single flat note. I didn't move. For a long time I didn't move. Because how do you breathe normally? After hearing something like that, I don't remember how long I sat there, but the light changed. The sky outside turned from golden to gray and the hallway lights began to hum. The nurse came in softly, glanced at the monitor, and laid a hand on my shoulder. I don't remember what she said. I just nodded. I stayed until they came to take her. I folded her blanket, closed the lotion bottle, turned the cracked teacup toward the wall. I didn't cry, not then. A little while later Caleb arrived, out of breath, suit jacket in one hand, phone in the other. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, pulling me into his arms. I left the meeting early. I tried to make it in time. I let him hold me. I let his words wash over me. He smelled like his cologne and someone else's perfume. I wasn't sure if I imagined that, or if I just wanted to. He didn't look at her, just at me. And I wondered if he already knew what she had said. That night, I lay next to him in our bed. The fan above clicked slow and steady. Outside, the wind rustled the dogwood trees. His hand rested on my hip. Like always, like habit. But I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel anything. Like habit. Like a script we'd both memorized years ago. I stared at the ceiling and wondered, when did closeness start to feel like a trap? I stared at the ceiling and replayed her voice in my mind. Not her last breath. Not the beeping machine. Just that one line. "Run from my son." By morning, Caleb was gone again. Meetings. Clients. Some emergency in Sacramento. He kissed my forehead before he left. I pretended to be asleep. When the front door clicked shut, I sat up. The house was still. Our bed felt too large. I walked down the hallway barefoot, each step colder than the last. I opened the linen closet, not sure why. Stared at the rows of folded sheets, smelled faint traces of cedar and starch. Then I turned to the last door at the end of the hall. Margot's room. We hadn't touched it in months. She'd moved into the hospice when her breathing got worse. But her things were still here. I opened the door. The air was stale and sweet, like old perfume and dust. Light filtered through the lace curtain, casting soft patterns across the oak floor. I stood in the doorway for a long time, not moving. Not sure what I was even looking for. But something about the way the mirror tilted on her vanity just slightly off-center made my stomach twist. Something was waiting. Or maybe, Something already knew I'd come. She once told me, "You can't fake weight. If something feels heavy, it probably matters." That sentence came back to me the second I pulled on the bottom drawer. It stuck. Like it always had. But this time I didn't let go. The morning light slanted through Margot's old curtains, dust catching in the air like it had nowhere else to go. The floor creaked under me when I shifted weight. Her room still smelled like cedar and old paper. Time had settled into the furniture, into the corners. Everything looked the same except her absence. I stood in front of her dresser, running my hand across the faded wood grain. Top drawer scarves folded neat. Second, a tin of brooches, some loose pearls. Third, empty sachets, lavender long dried. But that last one, the bottom drawer, refused. Like it had its own will. I tugged again. It moved a fraction of an inch, then stopped. My heart didn't race. It just slowed. Because something in me already knew there was a reason. Oh wait. I crouched, placed both hands on the wood, and pulled again. Nothing. And then another memory came. Margot once said, almost in passing, "The truth's always underfoot." She'd been talking about a cracked floorboard in the kitchen. Or at least, I thought she was. But now I wasn't sure. I got down on my hands and knees. The carpet under Margot's bed was still flattened in the middle, pressed down by time. Or by habit. I lifted the dust ruffle. The air underneath smelled older somehow. Like dry paper and something almost metallic. There, tucked deep near the headboard, a small velvet pouch. Green, faded, frayed at the edges. I reached in and pulled it out. It was heavier than it looked. Inside was a key. Brass. Tarnished. The kind of key that belonged to an old house. Or a locked drawer. I didn't hesitate. Didn't let myself. I walked back to the dresser, slipped the key into the lock and turned. It gave. So easily it made me wonder if someone had unlocked it before. The drawer slid open with a low wooden groan. Inside were 5 leather-bound diaries stacked neatly, edges worn. Each had Margot's handwriting on the spine, small gold numbers 2000, 2001, 2002, up to 2005. And on top of them an envelope. Thick, cream-colored. Labeled in neat block letters, 2005. My fingers trembled just once before I opened it. Inside were folded papers, newspaper clippings, and photos. The headline read, "Teen Missing, Ellie Granger 16. I didn't recognize the name, didn't recognize the girl at first. But then, I looked at the photo beneath the article. Caleb. Young. 19 maybe. His arm around a girl whose smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Ellie. That had to be her. And on her wrist a green beaded bracelet. One of the photos was grainy. A little overexposed maybe. But clear enough. I leaned closer. Hands cold, mouth dry. The girl Ellie was standing by a tree. Smiling. But her shoulders were stiff. Like the smile was staged. And on her wrist that same bracelet, green beads. But one was missing. I don't know why that detail hit me so hard. Maybe because it made her real. Not just a name in a headline. Not just a face beside Caleb's. That broken bracelet. It reminded me of the way Margot used to notice everything. How she never let a cracked cup go unnoticed. How she once told me, "It's not the things we say out loud that matter most. It's the ones we keep locking away." I sat there longer than I should have. Longer than made sense. The photos spread across the bed. The clipping in my lap. The drawer still open. I could hear birds outside chirping like the world hadn't changed. Like it didn't care that something small, something important had just cracked inside me. I'd never heard the name Ellie Granger before. But the look in her eyes, I'd seen it. In mine. The basement door had always been locked. I used to laugh about it. Even teased Caleb once. "What are you hiding down there, an old ghost?" He'd grin. Say something like, "It's just junk and mold. I'd rather you not get sick." Then he'd kiss my forehead light as air, like that was enough. And back then it was. But that was before Margot's last words. Before the photo of Ellie. Before the weight of a drawer that told me some things were never meant to stay buried. That afternoon it was cloudy. The kind of overcast that presses against the windows and makes you feel like you're being watched even when you know you're alone. Caleb had texted earlier. Board meeting. Should be back late. Then, did you take my toolbox? Can't find it. I hadn't touched it. But I didn't answer. The house was still. Even the fridge hum sounded louder than usual. I was in the hallway when I saw it. Not directly, but in the mirror across from the stairs. Caleb. Crouching down by the radiator panel. Sliding something behind it. Fast. Casual but too practiced. Like he'd done it before. I didn't say anything, just watched the reflection. And kept that moment quiet inside me like a breath held for too long. The next morning I waited until his car backed out of the driveway. Until the engine faded down the hill. Then I walked slow, deliberate back to the hallway. The radiator panel wasn't hard to move. It was loose on one side the way things come undone when someone's been tampering more than they should. I slid my fingers behind it, felt along the cold metal. And there it was. A key. Small, dull brass. Not the same as the one Margot left behind. Thinner, worn smooth at the top. I didn't guess where it fit. I knew. The basement. I'd passed that door for years. It was flush with the hallway wall painted the same soft gray. No doorknob, just a keyhole. Always locked. Always dismissed. But now, I stood in front of it, key in hand. Heart, quieter than I expected. When I turned the key, there was a soft click. Then a pause. My own breath. The distant creak of a floorboard somewhere upstairs. I pushed the door open. It didn't groan like in movies. No jump scare, just a slow swing and a rush of cold air that smelled not like mold. Not like dust. But something else. Damp wood. Old paper. And something I couldn't name right away. I stepped inside, flicked on the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. It flickered. Of course it did. Stairs led down narrow and finished. The kind that didn't invite you. The kind that warned you. I descended slowly. Each step creaked louder than the last. The light shivered against the concrete walls. Halfway down I paused. Held the railing with both hands. The cold felt like it had teeth. And across the basement, just visible in the dim light, was another door. Smaller. Painted the same gray as upstairs, but the lines were off. Like someone had tried to match it and didn't quite get it right. I raised the light. Took one more step. Then a sound. Soft, creaking, like wood shifting under pressure. But it wasn't from me. There was a smell. Not musty. Not rotten. Something older. Faintly sweet. And something else underneath, metallic almost. It hit me just as I reached the bottom step. I stopped. The beam of the flashlight landed on the small gray door. Paint chipping at the edges. A hairline crack where the wall met the frame. No handle. Just a slight indentation like someone had pushed too hard too often. I should have turned back. I told myself I was just imagining things. That old wood creaked. That basement smelled strange. But my fingers were trembling. And I couldn't convince my legs to move forward. Then the light flickered once. Twice. And in that moment of dim, I saw something on the floor near the door. A single green bead. Round. Familiar. Lying in the dust like it didn't belong. I bent slightly, not touching it, just staring. And then I turned around, climbed the stairs, one step at a time. Not because I was done. But because I wasn't ready. Not yet. When I closed the basement door behind me, my hands were cold. But my heart was steady. Because for the first time, I wasn't waiting for answers to come find me. I was going to go after them. And next time I wouldn't stop halfway. Truth has a smell. Not the poetic kind. Not the metaphor people toss around when they mean guilt or shame. I mean an actual smell. And it hit me the second I pulled up the trapdoor. Metal hinges groaned low like they'd been sleeping for years. Cold air spilled out damp and sharp and something else. Bleach. But behind it, something coppery. Something that didn't want to be forgotten. I covered my nose with the sleeve of my sweater, bent forward. Held the flashlight steady this time. The opening wasn't large, just a square cut into the corner of the basement floor disguised by paint and dust and nothingness. Inside, a narrow wooden ladder led down. Deeper. Much deeper than I'd imagined. The kind of deep that didn't happen by accident. I hesitated. Just for a breath. Then I stepped down. Each rung creaked. The sound bounced off concrete like whispers trying to hide. At the bottom was a narrow room. Walls raw and unpainted. Ceiling low. There was one hanging bulb, dim yellow light casting warped shadows across the floor. The ground felt sticky. And I tried not to think too hard about why. This wasn't just a storage space. It didn't feel like a room people forgot. It felt like a room people tried to forget. I moved the light slowly. Corner to corner, and there beneath a torn tarp something caught the beam. A hoodie. Gray. Torn at the sleeve. Too small for an adult. Familiar somehow. I stepped closer, bent down, picked it up with 2 fingers. It was damp. Smelled like mildew and time. Under it, tucked beneath a warped floor tile, was a small velvet bag, drawstring frayed, soft to the touch. I opened it slowly. Inside, beads. Round green. Identical to the one I'd found near the hidden door. Except this bag was nearly full. All but one. One was missing. I tucked the bag of beads into my coat pocket, the velvet soft against my fingertips, but the weight of it burned. Next to where the hoodie had been, something caught the light again. It was a mirror. Cracked down the center. Its surface fogged from moisture, age, and something like breath. I turned it slowly. On the back, scrawled in black marker, were 5 words. All caps. All uneven. Like someone wrote them in the dark with shaking hands. I screamed. She heard. I stared at the words. Let them settle in my chest. Tried to understand what kind of silence would come after something like that. Would Margot have heard? Would she have done anything? Her words echoed in me. I kept things quiet for too long. Don't repeat my silence. The mirror suddenly didn't feel like an object. It felt like a voice. I reached for my phone. Hands still shaking. Snapped photos, the hoodie, the mirror, the beads. Started a video. Spoke just above a whisper. This is beneath the Whitmore house. Found Thursday 11:36 a.m. documenting for record. My voice cracked. I stopped. Tried again. Tried to sound steady. Tried to sound like someone who wasn't scared out of her skin. I zipped the hoodie into a clear plastic bag, wiped the sweat from my palms onto my jeans. Looked around once more. There was nothing else. No blood, no bones. No body. But this wasn't nothing. This was intention. Someone had made this room. Someone had kept it hidden, and someone had come down here more than once. I took one last photo of the cracked mirror, zoomed in on the words. Then I heard it. A sound, not inside but from above. A car door, then another. Footsteps on gravel, quick. Then the front door opening. Caleb. Too early. My hands wouldn't work right. The plastic bag wouldn't close. Zipper caught. I shoved it into a woven basket by the laundry sink, covered it with a towel. Then flipped the trapdoor closed just as the hallway floor creaked above me. My shirt clung damp against my spine. I tried to slow my breathing. Tried to remember if I'd left anything behind. Then his voice. Hey babe, muffled from the kitchen. Casual. Like it was just another Thursday. I called back steady. Up here. Grabbed the flashlight, tucked the mirror between 2 boxes under the sink. As I stepped out of the basement, I reached into my pocket. Felt the bead. Smooth. Cold. Like a pulse that didn't belong to me. He was standing at the counter, tie loosened, keys in hand. You look tired, he said. His eyes scanned mine. Then a tilt of the head. Too practiced. Did you go down there? My mouth smiled before I could think. Of course not. He nodded. Looked away. Opened the fridge. Like nothing was wrong. But something in me had already shifted. Because it wasn't just what I'd found. It was that now, I knew how well I could lie. And I wasn't the only one. The letter wasn't long, but it said everything I'd been too afraid to say out loud. I sat in a chair that creaked every time I moved. Rain tapped steady against the old windows. There was a faint scent of burnt espresso coming from downstairs, someone over pulling shots again. Across from me, Thomas Laird leaned back, his fingers laced the kind of stillness that made it hard to breathe. He looked exactly how Margot had described him, buttoned up but sharp like a crow in a courtroom. I never understood the comparison. Now I did. I found what she left, I said. Just that, no need for anything else. He didn't blink. Just reached down into a drawer, pulled out a manila envelope with her handwriting across the top. My name, underlined once. She asked me to hold on to this, he said, his voice quiet. Only to give it to you if the circumstances felt wrong. They did. God, they did. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. Inside, a notarized letter, neat and formal, but beneath the legal phrasing I could hear her voice. If you're reading this, she'd written, then I've failed to say it aloud. I paused there, let that line settle in my chest. She hadn't just died. She'd gone knowing the truth still hung in the walls of that house. And she hadn't burned it down. She'd left the match in my hand. If anything happens to me, she'd written, Caleb is not blameless. There it was. Flat. Unapologetic. A sentence that made my stomach go tight. I stayed silent for too long. The next line read. Long enough to watch someone else's daughter disappear. I stopped reading. Looked up at Thomas. He didn't say anything, just gave me space. Let the words hang in the room, like steam rising from hot coffee. You don't blow it away. You wait until it cools. My eyes dropped back to the page. She was 16. Her name was Ellie Granger. And she trusted our family. I pressed my thumb into the edge of the envelope hard enough to leave a dent in the paper. She came to stay the summer Caleb turned 19, Margot continued. She had that laugh, the kind that made people turn their heads. But behind closed doors she changed. She grew quiet, avoided light. Her smile stopped reaching her eyes. I could feel my throat tighten. I'd seen that smile. In the photo from the drawer. And in my own mirror more times than I cared to count. I asked her once if she was all right, Margot wrote. She said, he said, it's what love looks like. And I said nothing. The penmanship faltered there, like her hand had shaken. Like the guilt had finally caught up. I saw her bracelet on the porch the day she disappeared. Caleb said she ran away. The police believed him. But I never did. I lowered the paper. Thomas still hadn't said a word. Did she ever tell you this? Out loud, I asked, voice thin. He leaned back in his chair, fingertips pressed together like he was weighing words. Only once, he said. And even then it wasn't clear, just worry. Regret. Fear she'd waited too long. He reached into his drawer. Pulled out a small black folder, leather-worn, fastened with a rubber band. Set it on the desk like it was nothing. But I could feel the weight. I've kept this for years, he said. Margot asked me to update it every time she revised her will. Each time she tucked in another piece of truth. I opened it. Inside were photocopies. Scanned letters. A notarized statement signed 3 months before her hospice stay. If I die under unnatural or unclear circumstances, the page read, please investigate Caleb Whitmore. My breath caught. She gave me 3 names, Thomas said quietly. 1 journalist. 1 detective. 1 attorney general aide. If anything happened to her or to you, these go out. He slid over a flash drive. Red-capped. Labeled MW, NG, final. And I've made 3 backups, he added, calm like someone who's done this a long time. 1's off-site. 1's on a timed send if I don't log in by Monday. The 3rd is yours now. I stared at the tiny device. So small. but everything about it felt sharp. Thomas's voice softened. "You understand what this means, don't you?" I nodded. Not because I did, but because I had to. I left Thomas's office with the flash drive in my coat pocket. It was still raining. Not hard, just steady, like the sky had settled into a slow sob. The coffee shop downstairs buzzed with quiet music and soft clinks of ceramic. I walked straight past it, didn't stop for tea. Didn't look up when the barista said, "Have a good one." Out on the sidewalk, I ducked beneath an awning and pulled out my phone. I opened a private cloud folder Caleb didn't know existed. One I'd made years ago, back when we merged finances, but I never quite merged my trust. I uploaded every photo from the basement. The diary entries. A scan of Margot's letter. Then I sent 3 emails. One to my college roommate, a tech consultant in Seattle. One to an old professor who taught media ethics. And one to an address labeled only Ren, archive. Each message said the same thing. "If you don't hear from me in 48 hours, publish this. All of it." I paused. Then hit send. Back at the house, I didn't even take off my shoes. I grabbed a small duffel from the closet, the kind we used to pack for weekend trips up the coast. Rolled a few pairs of jeans, sweaters, underwear, nothing too neat, just fast, silent. I stood in our bedroom for a long minute. The bed was made. Caleb's toothbrush lay dry on the sink. I glanced at the framed photo on the dresser. Us in Mendocino the first spring after we married. He was laughing. I was looking at him. I turned the frame face down, then slipped the flash drive into the hem of a sock and tucked it deep in my bag. By dusk, I was standing in front of a roadside motel just off Route 101. The neon vacancy sign buzzed like a bad memory. I gave the name Whitney Norris at the front desk, my middle name and my mother's maiden. The woman didn't blink, just handed me a keycard and said room 11, end of the hall. Inside, the light flickered once when I flipped the switch. The mirror had water spots. The bedspread was thin, but I was alone. And I was somewhere he wouldn't look. Not yet. I sat down on the edge of the bed and opened my phone. I sat there, knees pulled to my chest, watching the digital clock blink 6:42. The rain hadn't let up. It drummed gently on the roof, like someone tapping patiently, persistently. I opened my phone again just to check. No new emails. No missed calls. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, Caleb hadn't noticed I was gone. Then it buzzed. Unknown number. No name. No history. Just one line of text. "Where are you?" I stared at it. Didn't breathe. The number wasn't one I recognized, but the tone, I knew that tone. I turned off the screen, tossed the phone on the pillow. Tried to convince myself it could have been anyone. Then the landline rang. A sharp, outdated ring that sliced through the motel silence. Once. Twice. I didn't move. Third ring. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for the receiver, but stopped, my fingers hovering inches above it. Something inside me said, "Don't answer." Not yet. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the room held its breath with me. And somewhere between that ringtone and the silence that followed, I knew. He was looking. He said, "We could have been fine if you hadn't dug." I was standing behind the gas station gravel, underfoot the faint smell of diesel in the air. And I said, calm as the sky above us, I was never buried. That morning had started like any other, if you could call burnt toast and half-unpacked boxes a routine. 3 weeks had passed. I was living in Arcata now, a quiet town tucked inland from Eureka, close enough to trees and distance but far enough from memory. The apartment was small, a 1-bedroom above a knitting shop. Every night smelled faintly of eucalyptus and wool. The farmer's market set up on Wednesdays. Old men sold honey. Teenagers played folk songs on cheap guitars. I liked the noise. It made me feel porous again. Like I didn't have to hold it all in anymore. I'd changed my name at the pharmacy. Used my middle name again. Whitney Nora sounded like someone who didn't flinch in the mirror. Caleb hadn't contacted me again, not directly. But I saw the signs. An email login attempt. A voicemail from a number that clicked silent when I answered. Then that morning, as I was buttering a bruised piece of sourdough, my phone buzzed. One line. Come outside. No name, but I knew. I looked out the window. There across the street in the motel parking lot behind the diner was his car. The one with the chipped headlight he never fixed. He was leaning against it. Suit jacket off. Like he'd just driven through the night. I didn't grab my shoes. Didn't finish my coffee. I slipped the flash drive into my pocket, locked the apartment door, and ran out the back stairs. My feet slapped the pavement hard. Turned right at the alley, then ducked into the side entrance of a Chevron. There was a cashier behind the counter, young, distracted, biting a hangnail. I stepped up to him, breath short. Call the police, I said, quiet but firm. Please. Now. The cashier hesitated, then saw my face. Whatever he read in it, he picked up the phone. I backed away from the counter, ducked behind the snack aisle, heart thudding so loud it felt like a second voice. Through the narrow pane of glass, I saw Caleb. He wasn't pacing, he wasn't angry. He was still. That scared me more. He crossed the street slowly, hands in pockets, like this was just another afternoon, just another errand. I stepped outside before he reached the door. I didn't want anyone else caught in it. We stood 6 feet apart. He looked smaller, not physically, just like the person I'd built around him had collapsed. I came to talk, he said. I didn't answer. I figured we could sort this before you ruin everything. Ruin what? I asked. My voice surprised me, clear, unsentimental. His jaw tightened. You had a good life. We had a good life. Margot was sick. She didn't know what she was saying. She knew, I said. She always knew. He took one step forward. I didn't flinch. I made mistakes, he said, voice lower now. But you went too far. No, I said. You buried too far. That was when I heard the sirens. Not loud, not urgent, but steady, growing from the distance like something inevitable. Caleb turned his head. His shoulders stayed still. A sheriff's cruiser pulled up, then a second. I felt the wind shift as both doors opened. He didn't run. He didn't yell. He raised both hands, slow and smooth. Turned to look at me one last time. And for a second, just a second, I wondered if there was anything left in his eyes. But there wasn't. Just calculation. Just the absence of surprise. 3 days later, a small package arrived. No return address. No stamp. Just my new name written in careful print. It sat on the counter for hours. I wasn't sure why I didn't open it right away. Maybe I was afraid of more noise in a life I was finally learning to quiet. When I did open it, I used the edge of a spoon. Inside was a small black box. No bigger than a deck of cards. I recognized it before I touched it. Margot's handwriting was on the card beneath. For surviving what I could not. My fingers shook as I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in soft gray felt, was the bracelet. Green beads, cool to the touch. The broken strand had been mended. The missing bead was replaced with a pearl. Not new. Not perfect. Just enough. I held it in my hand for what felt like forever. Then I slipped it around my wrist. The clasp clicked shut. No ceremony. No explanation, just done. And for the first time since she said those words to me, I felt the weight of survival shift into something else. I didn't cry, I just wore it. The bracelet fit like it had always belonged. Not to my wrist, but to the version of me who'd never let herself look too closely. The one who finally had. The news stopped calling. The lawyers stopped emailing. And the world moved on. I still walked to the farmer's market every Saturday. I still bought pears too soft and flowers that wilted too fast. Some mornings I made toast and burned it anyway just for the smell. I didn't run anymore. But I didn't tell my name either. And I never took the bracelet off. Because sometimes the only proof you have that you made it through is the thing you carry without explaining. Margot knew that. Ellie should have had the chance to. I looked out the window that afternoon, rain ticking against the glass, and for the first time in weeks I heard nothing behind me. Just breath. My own. Steady. Has someone ever whispered something to you that made no sense in the moment but later changed everything? Tell me, I'll be reading. The first few days I kept checking the locks, twice before bed. Once at 3 a.m. Once more just because I heard the wind. I knew it was over. I'd watched them take him. I'd seen his face through the cruiser window and I knew he wasn't coming back. But my body didn't believe it. Not yet. I scrubbed the bathroom floor on the third day. Bleached it twice. Not because it was dirty, but because I could still smell the cedar oil from our old house. The one he used to mop the basement steps. That scent had changed for me. Like how burnt toast stopped being breakfast and started feeling like warning. Some days I opened the fridge and stared, not hungry, just counting things. How many eggs left? How many blueberries in the back? How many mornings until this didn't feel like hiding? The apartment was small but quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. No clock ticking too loudly, no footsteps overhead. Just the distant sounds of someone's radio on low and the buzz of the old refrigerator door that never quite sealed. I moved through the days like I was learning gravity again. Which floorboard creaked under my foot? Which drawer stuck halfway? And every night before I turned off the light, I looked at the flash drive Margot told me to keep. Taped behind the dresser. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. I knew what it held. But something about it being there, a silent thing in the dark, reminded me I hadn't made this up. Reminded me she'd seen it too. One morning I found a bead on the kitchen counter. A green one. Round. Cool. I don't know how it got there. I told myself it must have rolled from the lining of my coat pocket, but the way it sat dead center like it had been placed there. Well, some things don't need explaining. The worst part wasn't the silence. It was what filled it. Memories I didn't trust anymore. Moments I'd thought were real now coded in question. What did that laugh mean, that look? That time he drove me all the way to Bodega Bay and made me turn around halfway. Was it just about traffic? Or was there something he didn't want me to see? I wrote everything down. Not for the police. Not for a memoir. Just to see if my brain could sort what was true from what was beautiful. And every night before the lamp clicked off, I pressed my thumb to the bracelet. The new one. Margot's last gift. She'd worn it first. Ellie maybe after her. Now me. Like passing down not just pain but the will to survive it. It should have been over. That's what the news said. That's what the lawyer said. Even the woman at the pharmacy who didn't know me but watched local news smiled softly and said, "You must feel safer now." I nodded. Because that's what you do when someone means well. But I didn't feel safe. Not really. Something didn't sit right. It wasn't just fear, it was that hum in your bones when a story has too many loose threads. Caleb was in custody. Held without bail. The body had been confirmed. Ellie Granger's story was no longer a question. And yet I kept waking up at 2:16 a.m., always the same time. The second hand on the clock would freeze just for a beat, then start again. Little things. The sound of keys in the hallway when I hadn't given anyone a copy. The porch light flickering even after I changed the bulb. A voice in my head I tried to ignore. Margot once told me, some men don't act alone. They just learn how to pretend they do. I thought she meant his father. Or some dark metaphor about legacy. But now I wondered who else had helped Caleb. Who else knew? The envelope she left behind had names redacted. There were hints, initials, references to payments and silent partners. But nothing concrete. I hadn't asked Thomas. I wasn't sure I wanted to. And yet. That week I checked the mailbox 3 times a day. Not because I was expecting anything, but because I had the sense someone else was. One morning I found a slip of paper tucked between the weekly ad circulars. No return address. No envelope. Just one sentence typed. That bracelet doesn't belong to you. No name, no explanation. No fingerprints either, at least none the police could lift. When I showed it to them, the officer said, "Could be a hoax. These cases get attention. People get weird." And maybe he was right. But when I turned the note over, there was a faint imprint. A second line too light to be seen at first. I had to hold it under lamplight, run my fingers across the back like braille. "You weren't the first." I folded the note, put it in a drawer I never used. And that night when I took off the bracelet to shower, I noticed something new. Not on the beads, but inside the clasp. A scratch. Shallow. Intentional, barely visible. But unmistakable once you saw it. 3 letters. Etched in. EGW. Ellie Granger. And Whitmore. I didn't sleep that night. Because whatever I'd buried in the past 3 weeks, grief, fear, even relief, it just shifted. The story wasn't done. Not yet. I didn't go to the police again. Not this time. Instead, I printed the photos from the flash drive. Everyone Margot had left. Every note. Every scan of the letters, the receipts, the diary pages she never had the strength to read out loud. I placed them in an envelope, addressed it to Ellie's mother. I found her name in the old clipping, Marlene Granger. Still lived in Crescent City last I checked. No return address. No explanation. Just the truth. I mailed it on a Wednesday. Didn't track it. Didn't wait for a reply. Because justice doesn't always come from courtrooms or headlines. Sometimes it's the quiet act of putting truth into the right hands. I lit a candle that night. Not for Caleb, not even for Ellie. But for all the girls who were told to be quiet, who were warned too late. Who didn't get a Margot in their life. I sat by the window watching the candle flicker as the wind rose, and for the first time I wasn't waiting for anything. Not a knock, not a noise, not an answer. Just silence. The good kind. Sometimes it's not the loudest warnings that save us, it's the quiet ones. The ones whispered when no one else is listening. I used to think love meant staying, now I know it sometimes means leaving. Not out of anger, but out of knowing what survival costs when we ignore the signs. If you've ever carried a secret that felt too heavy to say out loud, know this. There is strength in finally speaking. There is peace in finally hearing yourself. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a moment, a name, I'd be honored if you shared it. Someone else might need your voice to feel less alone. I'll be here, still listening.